This is Henry Chamberlain. Today I'm speaking with Peter Kuper. Peter Kuper is a great artist, illustrator, cartoonist, co-founder of the activist comics magazine World War III Illustrated, going on over 40 years, ongoing publication. You can always find him at The New Yorker, The Nation, Mad Magazine, where he writes and draws the Spy versus Spy feature, and that's been going on for over 20 years. Today we're going to be, I also want to mention Ruins, which won the Eisner. And we'll talk about what connections there might be with Ruins and the new book, Insecttopolis. Thanks so much, Peter, for joining me today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks.
Now, I wanted to jump in by asking you, the typical question, if you could maybe do like a little elevator pitch to tell us what Insecttopolis is about.
Well, I'll tell you about how it came about. I got a fellowship at the New York Public Library, and I got it by pitching the idea that I was going to do sort of a guns, germs, steel history of insects, whatever that meant. And I've loved insects since I was maybe 4. And in fact, well, here's the insect book I got when I was 4, and I keep it by my drawing table. It's falling apart completely, but it's like a talisman to remind me of this long road that I happily have been on. So I wanted to do something about insects and the people who studied them, but I really didn't have a clear picture. I just sort of I showed them some pages from Ruins to get this fellowship, and the other part of it is you say how you're going to utilize the New York Public Library's archives. And one of their archives is they have Nabokov's original drawings. They have Maria Sibylla Merian, who is a incredible naturalist from the 1600s. They have her hand-colored lithographs. There's all this remarkable imagery and insect-related things in their archives. So I got the fellowship. I was told about it in February of 2020. It would start in September of 2020, and you may recall a pandemic hit about a month after or even earlier after I got that fellowship, where I was told about it. And so when I arrived at the library, they said, library's closed to the public. What's normally, it's 14 people that get this fellowship, and you have an office and you interact with the other people. There was the person who won the Pulitzer Prize for poetry. In the next office was Hernan Diaz, who the next year after the fellowship won the Pulitzer for his book Trust. There was writers from the New Yorker. I felt very much above my pay grade, and I got there very nervous about not fully knowing where I was going with the book. And I was wandering around the library. I went to the map room looking for a map that would show the path of the monarch butterfly, very much like what I did in Ruins following the monarch butterfly's migration from Canada to Mexico. And I was looking at the room, this empty room, beautiful architecture, and it just suddenly dawned upon me that I could use that as a backdrop. And it was kind of post-apocalyptic. So I thought, what if it's just like almost a ghost story where the insects are here and the people they're studying, who were in all cases anyway dead. These various people that I was interested in were ones from the past. And so then I started to form the idea of what I could do with the book. And it included these biographies of people. Darwin is in there, and Alexander von Humboldt, and the first African-American entomologist to get a PhD, Charles Henry Turner, and Margaret Collins, and people that you've never heard of. And then I kind of went piece by piece into different insects and pretended that the entire library was dedicated to insects and shows about insects. And so every room you went into would have a different story to tell.
Now that is the most amazing introduction. I was going to ask you about the New York Public Library because I'm hip to the that presentation. So was that an exhibit where you did some illustrations, or what was the component for the New York Public Library show when that took place?
Okay, well that was a one of those kismet kind of moments. I you feel free to open the book if you want.
Oh, of course.
A later part in it, and well, there's the hallways. Before you turn the page, there, back up one, back up to
Sure.
that end papers. Those very end papers there, that blue
Yeah.
there, that is actually, as I discovered, I asked some library worker, are there some rooms in the library I don't know about? And he goes, well, have you seen the part of the library that goes under Bryant Park for 2.5 blocks? I was like, no. And we went down there, and it's this vast space. It was under construction, but this same guy that worked at the library, one of the few people that was there during the pandemic, I talked to him about it. I asked him where, about where things, places I might go in the library. And you can keep flipping if you want,
Oh, of course.
just to,
I
let people
will.
see some of it. Um,
I will
and
follow your lead.
if you stop there, so
Sure.
that in the background there is actually an exhibition that I ended up having at the library because of this same fellow who showed me the part of the library that goes under Bryant Park. So I just was friendly to him. I was talked to him a couple of times. I showed him some of the drawings I was doing, and I was still figuring out where I was going with this. And when the fellowship ended after a year, I had a full year in the library throughout the pandemic. So I was riding my bicycle down from 99th Street, where I live, down to 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue, and in an empty New York City, and then back up, riding up through Central Park, which was quite remarkable. And this same guy happened to be in a meeting after the fellowship was over, where they were looking to do an exhibition in this space in the library. They didn't want to use original art, and they but they wanted something library related. He was like, "Well, I saw this guy's work, and I think it might be perfect." So they contacted me. I still was working on developing the book, so I could make a proposal to a publisher. And it's kind of hard to see in this lighting, but what you're seeing there, I did blow-ups of my drawings. And if you
Oh,
tilt it,
yeah.
maybe it'll, yeah, there you go. I did blow-ups of my drawings, and then they were made in vinyl and then put on the wall like that, full size. I had text on the marble that was die cut, sticky type. The cicada that you see kind of going off the wall there is dimensional. And there were a few elements in that there. It goes all the way down the hall, and then it picks up in another hallway where I have the flight of the monarch. So later in the book, you'll see if you go all the way to the back where the monarch is towards the end of the book, you can see a section where the further forward more, or back more, I should say.
Oh,
Um,
sure.
yeah, if you keep going, you'll hit another set of pages where the monarch butterfly is flying through the show.
Oh,
Uh,
sure.
keep going back further, a little more, and right next page. So there, if you stop, the monarch flies into the section of the show. And those are actually photographs of on the right hand side. Those are photographs of the exhibition that I have the monarch flying through. So I had a very, very meta moment where I was like, why not have the monarch go into the part of the real exhibition? I got them to paint the ceiling and put monarchs on the ceiling. Anyway, that was just like a complete uh, surprise that this guy happened to know my work, worked at the library, and they put that show up 4 months after I had my fellowship. And I mean, I was there working on it and designing it. And then it was up for 6 months, and that was just incredibly. And it was still going on during COVID. It went through just to the tail end of COVID, so that most people were masked up going there, and it was very it was more contained, but they printed 100,000 brochures for the exhibition, and they were gone before the exhibition was over. So I know somebody saw it.
Oh my goodness. Well, you see, I try to do my homework. I'm glad I asked. I wanted to ask you now, you said that there were other people, or what was it
Yes.
like being in that fellowship? Were you guys wearing masks all the time? Were you in
Um,
separate, each person in their own cubicle or room, or how did that work?
exactly. So it's 14 cubicles, and I mean, mine was very much of a cubicle. There's some that face out on Fifth Avenue that are a little more spacious. I was very happy in my smaller one because I could darken the room when I wanted to light box my drawings.
Hmm.
Um, so they changed all the rules because of COVID. So they said you can only be without a mask in your office. No consorting with the other people, which was originally part of the idea. So I thought, wow, what a ripoff. I got this fellowship the year that it's cut in half where you can't have this interaction. You have to do a presentation as you're working on your project to the other people. We were doing that on Zoom in our offices, and I was like, looked over, there's somebody watching me give a talk, which normally would have been in a bigger space, having lunch, et cetera, with the caviar or whatever they were serving. It wasn't caviar, but the finger sandwiches. And that instead it was this, we were all in our little tiny bubbles. And I at first thought this was a terrible thing, and then realized that I had the library to myself. And that translated into being able to go into rooms that nobody else would have been able to go into, to be able to uh, I mean, I went up on the balcony of the Rose Room, which is a normally a completely crowded room where everybody's got their jackets on the tables and there's computers. All that's gone, and so then it like turned into it was like this the turn of the last century in there, because the architecture is all from you know uh, like early 1900s.
Yeah.
And so it was like being stepping through a portal, a time portal. And that fit perfectly with doing this history of insects. So it really put me in the mindset. And I didn't mind the lack of interactions because I was so concentrated working on it that I was, you can keep turning pages if you want.
Of course.
Um, and so I was so concentrated on it that I was just working like all the time. I'd work until 7, get in there at 10, work until 7 at night, and then go back to my studio and work um, until midnight. I mean, that's the thing about COVID, was there was no socializing. So it kind of took a lot of things out of that would have normally been interruptions, not the right word for having friendships and, being married, but and having a child. But my daughter was fortunately grown up, and I was able to maintain relations with people through Zoom or whatever, however we did it then.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was really like being completely immersed with the experience, and that was just an amazing opportunity to get this project done, work on it in this concentrated way, and it still took me 4 years, almost 5 years to get it done. I
Well,
started it and started thinking about it in 2019. Here it is.
well, as you were saying, the pandemic component to all this, how could anyone possibly imagine something that monumental happening? But so did that inform the narrative because you had
Yes,
this?
very much. Spoiler alert. Yes, you want to go farther ahead. Wait.
Yes. So basically, the pages I've been turning, it's just a delightful conversation uh, talking about insects and about this
The
gigantic
history.
prehistoric insect that was like as big as a hawk. And then suddenly we fast forward to, oh, wait a minute, sometime in the future when there are no more humans.
And then insects get to arrive at the library
Yeah,
and
yeah,
then
they
start.
make their way through Midtown Manhattan and over to the New York Public Library.
Yeah, that was one of the first drawings I started. Actually, I started doing like before I could figure out what I wanted to do. I was doing just drawing in my sketchbook, doing like a beetle or two a day, and then contemplating and reading up. And And that introduces them to what's curious on that spread. You're there if you stop for a moment.
Sure.
So there is a show at the library currently called the Treasure Show. And in that show, there are some elements that I include, which, for example, Vladimir Nabokov's drawings of butterflies. But it's like the collection of the best of what's in the library. And that was not, they had not installed that yet, and it got blocked by COVID. But the room was set up with these glass cases. So I went into the room. I got permission to go anywhere as a Coleman Fellow, and they let me in, and then I photographed everything. So this is all, it's very, very photo based, although it is actually pen and ink drawings that I start with, like a light box combining the information from the photo and a lot of collaging of drawings and images of insects. And then it enabled me to do those more meticulous drawings. You can keep going and you'll see, but that's where I sort of introduced the idea that the insects are going to start talking, which let me have different voices for different insects and just completely load, every page with information and history and hopefully not do it in a didactic way, but have it unfold in a sometimes humorous, sometimes historic and informative way. But
Oh, yeah.
sort of mix and match with that, and that it just, I am so interested in the whole this area of science. I'm a citizen science. I don't have any degrees in anything, but one of the really exciting things that happened was while working on the book, I was able to reach out to the most famous entomologists, like the top expert on bees, the top expert on flies or cicadas or dragonflies, and converse with them and send them the chapter while I was working on and say, did I get this right? And so that, because it's a lot of information, and to get it right means, I want to just make sure I didn't find out after the book was published that I had made some technical error. And one of the things I'm doing in the book there, you see that honey bear,
Yeah.
is I'm pretending that there's an example in each exhibit of the connection between humans and insects. So the honey that we use, and then go into the history of, or the story of the bee, and then figure out different ways to tell these stories. So there's all sorts of there was all sorts of angles that I was just sort of stumbling upon as I read up on an individual insect that allowed me to discover new ways to tell it. Like in this part of the story, there's a fly called a hoverfly that mimics the look of a bee, and it's not a bee, and yet it looks like one from people. The naked eye would go, "There's a bee," and it's not. And so I could go into the whole idea of Batesian mimicry, which is why this theory of why they ended up looking that way, and then go into the story of this the guy who won the Nobel Prize for his discovery about bees, and just all these different. Oh, that's Bates, for
This is
example.
Bates.
Yeah, that's Bates, and then there's in the
Oh, here.
corner. Yeah, that would be Karl von Frisch, who was a Jew living in Germany, Jewish German, who then the Nazis wanted to evict from Germany during World War II, but they needed him around because of his expertise on bees. And so I get to, it weaves in all this crazy history. So it doesn't just stop at just talking about the insects. It's how they intersect with humans, and then just the insane stories that go along with that. And the insane stories about the insects themselves. Like this is telling the story of how bees in the hive will wiggle their asses to demonstrate where they found food and tell the other bees in the hive the direction that they should go to get to that food. And it's based on like the amount of wiggling tells them, like, it's literally like giving a map based off the sun. And so then how do I show that? And so that's my And comics are just ideal for this format for telling these stories. And of course, the intersection between comics and insects, as in say Winsor McCay, who did that very cool animation, How a Mosquito Operates in
Yeah.
1912, which you'll see on the next page. And I even, or sorry, page after that. There you go.
Yeah, here we go.
And that's actually Winsor McCay's, pictures from Winsor McCay's animation. So I got to just like dive into every angle that I could dig up. And he did a Dream of the Rare Big Fiend that was kind of like that. And then all the posters that they used in World War II about mosquitoes. So it's anyway. Um, and this is how mosquitoes have brought us all together because everybody hates mosquitoes.
Well, I love how you build upon one thing after another. I was going to ask you, you've already pretty much answered. I was going to ask you about the process of how do you collect the data, organize it, and then seamlessly put it together. And you're basically we're talking about it as right this moment. Uh,
Well, there's actually more to it than that
oh,
because
of
I
course,
did something different with this book than I have ever done in a graphic novel. You were holding up Ruins before. In
yes.
Ruins and in virtually every graphic novel I've done, I have this multi-stage approach where I do a thumbnail really tiny, where I'm writing what happens on each page. Then I do another thumbnail, like on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, I can map out 50 pages. So I know what every spread is going to be like, etc. And then I do a smaller pencil version, and then I blow that up and I do a same size pencil version that's tighter, and then I blow that up and I go into a tighter pencil, and then ink it and then color it from there, sometimes digitally and sometimes by hand. So there are all these stages that are all mapped out. With this book, I was reading and studying, and I just wanted to be able to move forward. So I would do like one page, not knowing what was going to happen on the next page. And
Hmm.
so I would continue studying, going, okay, I roughly know where this is going, but how am I going to get there? And so, for example, just even that where I threw that page in where people are slapping themselves in different languages, that was I had that like as a little notion about something that was the connective tissue of mosquitoes, but didn't know how it would land. And each chapter was built as a modular single unit, and I decided where the chapters would go at the end of the book. I didn't fully know where most things were going to happen, and that whole roll up at the beginning where I have a brother and sister talking and walking and going through the history, I also sort of stumbled on. Though I knew I wanted to do a history, I didn't know how that history would be told. So I like kind of like slightly seat of the pants went, oh, I was doing these big drawings of spreads of, let's say, the dinosaur era of insects, and then I realized it was I just had like a voiceover, and that just wasn't sufficient. So I added these characters walking through the city and talking to each other, and it was much more. It was less overwhelming to take in the history that way. So
Well,
there was just
yeah.
a lot of discovery that came along, and I think one of the things that worked for me, what made the book work better in many ways was I was being surprised as I moved along. I didn't really know where things were going to go, and so I did some pages where then I tore them apart and said, I've put um, like what should be 3 pages of history on one page, and the reader needs more air, and so I would dismantle the page and make it much, take 4 or 5 pages to say the same thing that I thought I could jam into one.
Oh,
But
that's yeah, that totally makes sense. I kind of lost my train or recalibrated my train of thought when I saw this page, because this page takes on a different tempo from the last number of pages we were seeing. And I was
yes,
thinking that, okay, I believe that Peter is doing maybe some shuffling around, which makes total sense because you have so much information, so many opportunities, so many ways to go that I can see where you would say, oh, I just want to get into cicadas for a while and I'll come back
exactly.
Yeah.
I jumped all over the place. I would do one drawing of a cicada one day and then a drawing of a dragonfly the next. And when I started the project, I was still, I didn't have all of this information. And so I was, basically doing a drawing that I estimated would be good for a chapter. I was like, that looks like a good chapter start. And sometimes that chapter start would end up being 3 pages in. And I would start, in a different way. Like the dung beetle chapter, I did a big drawing, a full page drawing of a dung beetle pushing a dung ball down the hall, and then I went that's forward in the book, I believe.
Is it?
Uh,
Oh,
yeah, it's later. The
mm,
dung beetle shows up a few times. There he
yes.
is. So,
Indeed,
um,
he does.
so the if you go backwards a bit more, you'll see where um, the dung beetle, I go into the history of the dung beetle, but where the dung beetle, that's that page there on the right, I did first. And then I was like, oh, you know what? I want to add like a little different introduction to the dung beetle, but I could do that as a standalone and then see where it lands later. And then the next drawing I did was a dragonfly going up the stairs, and it just,
Yeah.
uh, it just kept on morphing. I knew, for example, that chapter you were just passing there with on ants, that I wanted to do something with where I would, oh yeah, there's the dragonfly going up the stairs. So I did that right after I did the dung beetle.
Oh,
The,
wow.
there was an ant chapter where my first thought about it was I wanted to think about how ants in horror movies like Them, or the H.G. Wells Empire of the Ants book, which he wrote in the turn of the century, last century. This sort of horror image related to insects, the way we morph them into these giant insects and like examine that relationship. Because certainly I don't know what the percentages are on who's completely horrified by insects and can't stand them, and who thinks they're really cool. And then there's the middle place that was like tolerating them. I'm way over in the love insects category, but part of what I'm hoping I'll do with this book is get people to consider, you know, reconsider, even if they hate them or are afraid of them, reconsider how they fit into our world. By the way, on that page there on the right lower hand corner
Yeah.
is a QR code.
Yes.
And the book is loaded with QR codes where if you put your camera up to that, and even now if you do that, you will it will jump to the dragonfly expert who I'm interviewing, um, talk about um, the history of dragonflies, and I've slipped them in throughout the book, and they were part of the show that I had at the library, and they will be part of my next exhibition, which is at the Society of Illustrators that I'll be opening in about a week.
Well, you know what? I imagine that you're probably breaking new ground. You're probably the first significant work of graphic narrative using the QR code to extent that you're using it.
That was a complete stumble on because somewhere along the time of getting the exhibition together, I was sort of just thinking about everything that I could possibly do in an exhibition that sort of steps out, like takes the art and moves it into a venue, like an exhibition space. So like painting the ceiling and putting monarchs on it, and some of the things are hanging down or sticking off the surface, that I don't have in the book. But the having something sonic, because insects like cicadas, they're like they make a sound at 100 decibels, which is like a motorcycle. And I was asking at the library if we could, part of my exhibition, have some kind of sonic element. And one person was like, yeah, that would be really cool. We actually have a directional speaker that, if you got under it, you could hear it, but you wouldn't when you stepped away. But, the tendency in libraries is to go shush. And
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
somebody else stepped in and said, no sound. But I was like, well, what if we record sound and then we do these QR code kind of things? And I had seen that before in some other show they had done. And the guy who had done the recordings for the library turned out to be the same guy who had shown me where you could go see the part of the library under Bryant Park, and was the one who ended up getting me this exhibition So he had a recording set up at the library, and we either interviewed in person or brought in entomologists or did it by Zoom and did these recordings. And it was, I thought that was just for the exhibition. And then while I was working on the book, I should roll it back one step. While we were doing the recordings, he said, we need some background music for this. And so I'm looking on the web for like free downloadable insect sounds. And I stumbled upon a podcast interviewing a musician named David Rothenberg, who did music and even wrote a book called Bug Music, which you can listen to on Spotify. He wrote the book, and then he did an album where he takes the sounds of crickets, cicadas, you name it, dragonflies, and then plays clarinet, drums, guitar, things like that, synchronizes with them. Does really beautiful ambient music using them.
Oh, wow.
And I reached out to him, like I needed to get this music in one day. And I reached out to him at night, and in the morning he had responded and said, yeah, sure, you can use my music for free. And so it's in the QR codes too. So if you go to one of those QR codes, but keep flipping. It's nice
Sure,
to see
sure.
So all these cool histories. So everywhere I looked, I was coming on a new history. There's the giant dragonfly that is or it's actually a griffin fly that's the ancestor of the dragonfly.
Yeah, I love how you come back to it.
So it's like 310 million years ago. This was around. They had those huge bodies because the oxygen content was like 35% as opposed to the 21% that we have now. So your body could sustain more capacity and they could grow larger. And they were the first thing that flew, right, before birds existed by millions of years. And they had no predators, and they were the number one predator virtually.
Well, I wanted to ask you, I'm going to sort of awkwardly insert a question. Now you talk about the what we know so far, because we're going to learn. We don't know everything by we just don't know everything yet. Who knows if we ever will? But what we do know is there's some self-determination that's been figured out that insects have.
Oh yeah.
What can you tell us about the intelligence of insects? How intelligent do you think insects are?
Extremely. I mean, you mean with emotions and all that? They're in the midst, and like right now, it's actually a pretty it's a point where there's more more new information coming out. But just for example, going back to even I think in the 1800s or early, no, I'm sorry, in the early 1900s, the entomologist Charles Henry Turner was determining that ants are not robotic, that they have their communications and there's a lot of things that they do that express intelligence. Bees can see color. That he did all these tests with moths to determine that they would remember and have fear about something that would translate to later. Let's say he was doing sort of a Pavlovian experiment where he would, like, of course, there's a lot of insect torture involved in order to figure these things out, but he'd like rough up a moth with a certain kind of music playing. And then later he would play the music and the moth would react to the music without the rough up. Another really crazy thing is they did something similar with a monarch when it was a caterpillar, and then it goes into the chrysalis. And one of the absolutely nutty things I still almost can't believe is when there's the metamorphosis that happens from monarch caterpillar to monarch butterfly in the chrysalis, it goes into a liquid form. And they determined that even it goes from liquid reforming into a butterfly, the butterfly has memory from when it was a caterpillar, even then it turned into a liquid. And they're finding more and more about the possibility of different emotional things and just generally parenting, careful parenting. Cockroaches have. They're very social, and the dung beetles are like long-term mates, and so are termites. They mate for life. The queen termite and the king. The king just basically hangs out for 4 years, and to be there as sex slave for the queen, and they have sex. I think tens of thousands of times a day, and I'm sorry, that's the amount of eggs that she can lay. But they're
Yeah.
having sex all the time, and I have a whole section on insects,
Hmm.
and insect sex, and so yeah, so there are just so many avenues on this that I went down, and the studying the emotions. I mean, I could probably do another whole book going into that area.
Well, you're like the ideal person to interview because you've anticipated a number of my questions, so I just let you go and I enjoy what you have to offer. There was one thing I wanted to bring up, um, the nuclear war, atomic bomb stuff
Yes,
going on. Now, that ties in with a lot of your political stuff and World War III illustrated, and
there you are.
there's this
Yep,
atom,
we
this
passed it.
the ants. Now
Yes,
the dragonflies, they get a bum rap, and the ants certainly get a bum rap as well. Hollywood has demonized them, and it's just a beautiful extended piece. Could you say something
yeah.
about that?
No, that was something that was one of the sort of I had like little tiny, like look into this notions about these things, and one of them was the whole. I mentioned this earlier. Was one of the notions of like why did they make all those movies where everything was enlarged? Well, I mean we kind of know this now anyway that like Godzilla was Japan's um, uh, taking the Hiroshima and Nagasaki and kind of visualizing it through using a monster. And the we did the same thing very much with in movies like them, where and for that matter, in the history of comics, radiation, gamma rays, all these things that we were like they creeped us out. We're always having some sort of like superpower impact. And you'll see in the upper right hand corner there, those insects are drawn by actually a woman named Cornelia Hess Honegger, who's in Switzerland, where did drawings of insects that were near, say, in this case, the radiation of Chernobyl, and and how they were diseased and mutated by radiation. And so I just thought, like, this dovetails, of course, with my desire to talk about these things like the bomb and working on a magazine called World War III Illustrated. Would fit into that. And I have the one of the characters that's talking to the ants. The ladybug is actually from around Chernobyl, and Chernobyl is in Ukraine, which when I was doing this book in the first place, the war in the Ukraine had not occurred yet, and so it was the way these things sort of catch up in strange ways. And But I was really fascinated by the idea of our how we process our fears and then you put it onto something. And so, but that probably then translated into people furthering people's fears of insects that were really coming from our fear of our own creations rather than necessarily them. And but and also our battle with insects, which has translated into us, say, poisoning ourselves with DDT, for example, for mosquitoes, but also there was the huge battle against red ants that the entomologist E.O. Wilson, who was studied ants, called the Vietnam of entomology, because we fought and fought against trying to kill off the highly invasive fire ants, and we lost that battle. They ended up just expanding, in fact. Um,
Yeah.
there's a whole chapter in there that you're just on know where you just were before of Nabokov, but it goes into
Oh, yeah.
the it goes into the story of Osamu Tezuka, and one of the very cool things was discovering that Tezuka was a super insect fan. And while I was starting to tell his story, I thought I was rereading for the millionth time Understanding Comics. So on that spread there, I thought, the way manga tells a story, the right left um, reading, I was going to switch into doing in the style of Tezuka and in the reading in the Eastern manner of manga reading, and hopefully get the reader to follow along at least for a section, turning to a different kind of storytelling. The beauty of this project in general was that stylistically I could go in different directions like this, and it wouldn't be jarring, or hopefully not. And that came out of generally I have a lot of different styles and approaches that I use. When I did Kafka, I did it in scratchboard, so it was more like German expressionism. When I mean, adaptation of Heart of Darkness, it was a little bit more sketchbook. I'll get more cartoony with some things that are, say, some autobiography. And then I spent years doing stencil and spray paint comics, as I did with The System and Sticks and Stones and my adaptation of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. But this opened the door on whatever style I thought was appropriate I could go into. So it gets realistic at sometimes, gets cartoony at sometimes, and not, don't stick with one thing. And that's a big, there you go. Where are you going right there? So
Yeah,
that's a watercolor.
totally different. Yeah.
Totally different style.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, I can do that. It's a different, because it fits with the story I'm telling.
Well, I'm fascinated with cicadas because I was a West Coast person for a very, very long time, decades, and then suddenly I was thrown onto the East Coast and the southern East Coast, and cicadas, you hear them, they're very loud little fellas,
Oh
and
yeah.
it was it, and so yeah, they are definitely on my radar. So it's a treat to see this the life cycle, the very long underground life cycle of the cicada before they finally get to go
Well,
up
when I
upward.
did the if you go back a page, when I did the rut, I sat out. I was outside actually in the summer when I was working on this, and I just had like an aha moment of creating this relationship where the cicada is talking to the tree, because
Yeah,
this in the true story of the cicada, they, another completely nutty thing, they drop from the tree in this, and they're in between stage from adult to the egg drops down from the tree. It's been implanted in a branch. Then when it comes out, it drops down to the ground, then burrows down in the ground and stays there, quite awake, by the way, for 17 years. And it is staying alive by getting the sap from a tree root. And they believe, they don't have this nailed down, but they believe that, like, there's a change in the pH in the tree root that is part of the signaling to say it's been 17 years. And also there's a temperature change when it hits like 64 degrees, not like, I think it is 64 degrees. Then they will all emerge, but they are emerging all at the same time, all in separate pods, by the millions. And so there's a signal that goes out to them. And there's a few things that are like this, where the people that have been studying them can give you a general idea of how it works, but don't know exactly. And so the mysteries that this, the heading it falls under, of great mysteries of the earth, there's so many of them. And that it's just like, that was part of the joy of this exploration, because it just didn't ever end. Like what I found out, and then I was learning, and I'm still only on book one of diving into these histories. But it just struck me while sitting outside and trying to figure out how to tell this story. Oh, there's the relationship between the cicada and the tree, and then doing the panel design on the next page, if you flip, to do it in that vertical fashion, so that you had the contrast between above and below, and then the seasons could be changing, and how that would be, sort of how to represent that. So that just kind of hit me all at once, and I just roughed it out, and then it unfolded as I moved forward on doing more final art.
Well, like I was saying earlier, I a lot of what you say has anticipated a lot of my questions, so it's a delight. You made my job that much easier. But yeah, like there's always something I can ask you. This I wanted to
Well,
bring up for
yeah,
sure.
there's one you could talk about for sure.
Yeah,
DDT, as I mentioned before.
yeah. So you have these two esteemed scholars, Margaret Collins and
Rachel Carson.
Rachel Carson, as children, and then as the conversation gets more serious, they get older. It's just a wonderful sequence.
That was another thing I stumbled on because, I was telling these different stories and how can I do it so it's not monotonous?
Yeah.
And for myself and for as well as for a reader. And there's, both of their stories, like putting them together was so perfect. These two ghosts come together as kids and then grow up and then they tell each other's stories. And when Margaret Collins' story, she was, or you don't know, I'm telling you, is he was coming of age during the civil rights movement and was very active. And she had to deal with sexism, where when she was the first African American woman to get a PhD in entomology, and her professor didn't want her to go on the expeditions because a woman would be a distraction. And then when she got a fairly high position at a university and then had to move to another university because they were sort of blocking her, excelling. And that image, well, before you go on,
Oh,
that
sure.
image of where I just noticed that the mound of a termite had the shape that might be like a KKK hood. And
Hmm.
so that gave me the opportunity to tell about her activities in civil rights. And another aspect of this is to show, well, the broad spectrum of people that have been involved in these fields, the uphill battle that they had to go through, and the and that a lot of them are still not known generally. And so even ones that are might be famous in their own uh, for one reason or another, or were famous, and then like Alexander von Humboldt was hugely famous, and then just during World War One, anybody who was German, which he was basically shoved out of history. And what we're experiencing currently with this insane rewriting of history that the administration is basically trying to erase people like well, anybody that isn't uh, I anybody that doesn't subscribe to their perspective on what the history they want to tell about America.
Yeah.
And so here's Margaret Collins. It was she did though she was dedicating herself to studying insects during the civil rights movement. She was putting a lot of energy into fighting against racism and kind of put her career on hold to do that. And was really dedicated in getting harassed for it. So there's just these incredible heroes. If you flip the page, you'll see the story um, of Rachel Carson, who did this book Silent Spring, which was a huge hit in the United States, and it caused, like, Kennedy was president at the time. It caused them to the Senate to at least discuss banning DDT. It didn't get banned, but it was a big it had a huge impact on making people aware of the environment, making an environmental movement get rolling, and that she was instrumental in that. And I'm not sure how many people are you know growing up today know about her. So that's one of the things that I can do here is bring these people to the fore or keep them front and center while we're at a point where all these things are so urgent, um, where we're at a place where the government is saying we can't say climate change. and we're going to scrub that from our history.
Oh, I know. God, well, I don't even want to. That's
Yeah, I
quite
know, I know. It's
a kettle of worms.
yes, a kettle of worms or a mound of termites.
And then we have the monarch on its way out, and it makes a detour to speak to a cochineal. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, cochineal. It's the insect that made the. You can pause right there. That's where it makes the red coats red. The fabric that was used in carpets, also the red for the first U.S. flag. Vermeer used it in his paints. It's this incredible history, and it's this little tiny insect that happens to be
Yeah.
found in particular. That's a little teeny insect that you find on cactus in Oaxaca, which is where I lived for 2 years with my wife and daughter, and it's what inspired both the book Diario de Oaxaca, which is my sketchbook from that time in Oaxaca in 2006 to 2008, and Ruins.
Yes,
And
of
so I
course.
tell that story in a little bit in Ruins, but in Insectopolis, I go into it in detail and found out this remarkable stories behind that. Like for example, that Spain kept cochineal, that it was an insect, secret for 250 years, and they built their empire on this valuable thing. And that's a story right there of a Frenchman who snuck into Mexico and walked to Oaxaca 600 miles to steal the cochineal. He didn't even know what it was he was looking for, and then when he found it, he managed to slip it out, get as far as what became Haiti, and then in an attempt to get the cochineal back to France and break Spain's grip on this incredibly valuable resource, which it was literally as valuable as gold or silver, and that everybody in Europe wanted it, and Spain had that as their fortune. And the town of Oaxaca, where I was living, was built up and is made into this magnificent city because of the value of the cochineal. It's still used. I can still find it. Like when I go down there, I just walk up to a cactus. There it is. It creates this dye, and so there was just these crazy stories, and that he was doing this in 1776.
Yeah.
That's where the story came from. And I listened to his journal. It was like an 8 hour book on tape. That was a little more torturous, I have to admit, to get through the whole thing. But I got all these fabulous details. So while I was drawing it, I was listening to it and expanding my story.
Well, I have to know when to close things out because you've been so generous with your time. And if there's something I'm missing that you wanted me to mention, feel free to say. I mean, some of the questions I was going to ask you towards the end, there's like some stock questions. What are you most proud of about the book? Or how about this one? What is your favorite insect?
Well, a lot of people ask me that, and among the Beatles, I think I probably would say Ringo. But in general, it's very difficult. The dung beetle has this sort of sad aspect to it that I love. The cicada also is the same thing.
Yeah.
Um, it was, each chapter I would turn to an insect. Monarchs, of course, since they're the poster child for insects, that they're easy to love, and I've spent a lot of time with them. So I'm like, enough with the monarch. There's so many valuable insects. Just for example, the second biggest pollinator you'd never guess after the honeybee is
The
the
fly.
frog.
Yeah.
Yes. So, weird things like that. Um,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, so it's hard to pick a favorite in many ways. But I guess what I would say, what is exciting to me about this book hasn't happened yet, and I have my fingers crossed. I know it's happened in little ways from people who have gone to the exhibition and the handful of people who have seen the work, who hated insects and told me that after seeing my work, it it moved the dial a little bit. And I really am hoping that will happen because we're sort of in a desperate state for changing our attitudes. Because there's a quote I have at the beginning of the book, which I'm going to slightly mangle, but it's by E.O. Wilson, the ant expert, and he says that if humans were to disappear, the world would return to its natural state of abundant beauty and growing green. And if insects were to disappear, the world would collapse into chaos. And that's, people, it's so easy to forget how much we desperately need them and how literally grocery stores would be empty without pollinators, and that we'd be knee deep in poop without the dung beetle and the flies that break down things that are dead. We would just literally, the world would be a much smellier place, and there'd be dead things all over. So we just, it's really easy to regard insects as this, because they're, you're slapping a mosquito or you're creeped out by a cockroach. But I'm hoping that the readers are going to find their way to a different perspective that just, ease them out the door and recognize that, all insects are, don't not hate a mosquito and or a sand flea or a bed bug. They're a big fat drag. Who wants to get be harassed? But recognize that that we need them, and even for that matter, an example, the no-see-ums or biting midge is where we get chocolate from. So if they didn't pollinate chocolate, no chocolate, or we wouldn't have coffee. We wouldn't have honey, etc. So I see insects in my life as sort of proof of life. And so when I see a cockroach, I just ease it out the door. I don't stomp on it. I've done enough of that.
Oh gosh, that I'm thinking the same thing. I think what your book does, and I'll try to say it as eloquently as I can, it makes you more hypersensitive to the fact that you're just a being observing stories about other beings.
Yeah, and if you look into it, then each one of them has a rather remarkable story and is in many ways intrinsic to our own development.
Now, I want to emphasize to folks to seek out ruins if you haven't. And then this is Insecttopolis without the book cover. We took the book cover off because we were looking at the
Sure.
end papers, but
I
there's
love
the
the end
cover.
papers too, but yes,
Yeah.
there's the cover. And I would just say that I have this exhibition opening in next week at the Society of Illustrators, and um, that's going to actually go. And there's the coloring book,
Yeah.
the companion coloring book. There's actually even one more. There's a Monarch's Journey, that the black and white drawings from ruins that is just coming out literally like right now. It's going to come out next week.
Oh,
And
wow.
there's examples of the originals at the Society of Illustrators, and it'll be up all the way until the end of September. So if anybody's in New York, they can catch it. If they don't catch it for the book party on May 22nd, they can catch it anytime throughout the summer.
Well, thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for doing that.
Thanks for taking the time, and love insects, please.